Okay.
Good afternoon to you all here in Sarasota, both on Zoom and in our Kemp of Sholom social hall, and a very special welcome to privileged guest, honored guest, Colonel Kemp in London. We are so proud to have you with us today. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd just like to say a few words about our previous series. This falls under our program under the excellent Isaac Bulgaria.
And that's why
last year's highly successful season is now being followed by another scintillating presentation. We very much enjoyed the stimulating presentation of Dr. Jack Wertheimer. We now have even more impressive array of new speakers this season. We have Colonel Kemp with us here today, and his presentation will be followed by further monthly Zooms, starting in December. Esteemed Rabbi Dr. York, who is the leading rabbinic authority in the conservative Jewish movement. He will be followed in January by Professor John Barton, the world's preeminent biblical scholar. In March, as our scholar in February, part of our scholar in residence series, we'll have Dr. Mor Al-Shulur from Israel, who is Rabbi Al-Shulur's cousin. This should be spectacular. She will be speaking on various topics related to Israel, and this is in conjunction with Israel's 7th birthday. In January 8th, Mr. John Barton, as I mentioned, and then in March, we will have Melanie Phillips, who is a distinguished journalist speaking to us from Jerusalem. She writes for the Jerusalem Post, as well as the Times of London, and many other prestigious newspapers, and this should be very stimulating. In April, we will have Professor Dr. Anthony Polanski, Professor Emeritus from Brandeis University. He is a notable world authority on Eastern European Jewry, a 3-volume set of Europe. His presentation the forthcoming trip that he will lead with Rabbi Al-Shulur to Vilnius and Eastern Europe. So please check the messenger and your regular e-blast to get further information on all of these presentations. Before we begin our presentation, I'd just like to establish a few ground rules. While Colonel Kemp is speaking with Rabbi Al-Shulur, please stay muted, and you can then unmute when you're called upon for the Q&A session. The Q&A session will follow the presentation. Questions will be taken both from the audience here and also those on Zoom. Those in the social hall, please address the audience.
No, she keeps unmuting.
So now it gives me great pleasure to have Al-Shulur come up, and he will commence the dialogue with Colonel Kemp.
Thank you, Dr. Ferber, Eric. Colonel Richard Kemp is a big part of my time in London. I can tell you there has been no one who has done more for our people, for the state of Israel, with passion and courage and conviction than this man. This is an hour that you are not going to forget, and all of us should know this man. He has gone the length to Gaza, the border, Israel's wars, fought for Israel in the United Nations, at the Human Rights Council, and is one of Israel's great military advisors. Colonel Kemp is a hero of the United Kingdom military. He has, if I have this right, he served 30 years in the British military from 1977 until his retirement in 2006. He fought in Afghanistan. He fought in Iraq. There is no one who has experienced more of our lifetime on the critical points of the world than Colonel Kemp. He has risen from lieutenant to captain to the title of colonel that he achieved in the year 2004 before his retirement. He has since his retirement been a writer, publisher of books, many articles that have appeared in countless number of media outlets, both here in the United States as well as in the United Kingdom. He is on Al-Qaeda's death threat list, which is a badge of honor for him. And God willing, he will be protected from the harm that he brings himself to so many of the hotspots of our world. He received an honorary doctorate, which is very rare for someone outside of Israel, of his background, to receive an honorary doctorate from Bar-Ilan University in 2015. And boy, do I remember Colonel Kemp, not only as a dear friend, but every time there was a problem, whether it be with the rise of anti-Semitism from the Islamic community, from the Muslim community, from Jeremy Corbyn, was Colonel Kemp always at the front line, the main speaker, and any attack against the Jewish people. Spoke with passion and sincerity. He is an Ohev Yisrael. He is a lover of the Jewish people, never to be forgotten by any of us. And so this is a great, great privilege to have you, Colonel Kemp, with us, and to cross the bridge here across the water to be with our congregation. Thank you so much. So I thought we would begin, if you could give us a little bit of a tell us about yourself, your background, and how you connected with the Jewish people in Israel, which became so much a part of your passion today. Welcome. Shalom.
Shalom. Thank you very much, Rabbi. And no one's ever spoken about me in such glowing terms before. I'm sure you must be exaggerating a great deal there, but thank you nevertheless. Thank you. I'm, as you can tell, and as Rabbi mentioned, I'm from the United Kingdom. I live in a small town outside of London. I'm in London now, but I'm not normally in London. I went to school, a small state school, and I left school one day and joined the army the next day. And I then spent the next 30 years, as the Rabbi mentioned, as a British soldier. During that time, I served in pretty much every theatre of operations the British Army fought in over that period, certainly every single one I could get myself into. Because if you join the army, if you are an infantry soldier like I was, you want to fight. You don't necessarily want people to die. You don't necessarily want wars, but you're trained and qualified and you're the best person to do it. It's a bit like a surgeon. A surgeon wants to cut someone's leg off. It's not because he wants that to happen, but he knows that if it's got to happen, he's the guy that's best placed to do it. And I took the same approach to armed conflict. I led a relatively standard military career, culminating really pretty much in command of British forces in Afghanistan back in 2003, in the days we were winning the war. I take most of the credit for that to myself, but I think many others would disagree. One of the unusual aspects of my career was that I spent probably the last 5 years of my military service working in the Prime Minister's office in London as the head of an intelligence assessment team looking at international terrorism for Tony Blair, who was the Prime Minister. Since I left the army in 2005, 2006, I've been as Rabbi mentioned, I've been a writer. I've been a media commentator on broadcast and written media. And I spent a great deal of my time focusing on Israel. Not all of it, but quite a lot of it. Most recently, I probably spend more time dealing with the Ukraine war than I do with Israel, but these things come and go, of course. But Israel, I think, has been a constant in my life for many years. My story, I think, as to why I'm involved with Israel and have been involved with Israel goes back to my father. My father never went to Israel. To my knowledge, he never met a Jew. There aren't that many in England. But he had a very, very positive, very warm approach to Israel. He was a soldier in the Second World War. he knew what happened to the Jews in the Second World War, and he firmly believed that the Jews should have their national homeland in Israel, which wasn't necessarily a particularly popular point of view in Britain in the sort of 70s and well, the 60s and 70s. And so I think, you know, I without a doubt, my kind of, I suppose, my positive approach towards Israel was shaped by my father. But I didn't really go to Israel until much later. And the British Army don't really serve much with the Israelis. So I didn't have much to do with the Israelis, a little bit here and there, not very much until I was working in the Prime Minister's office. And when I was there, I worked extremely closely with the chief of the Mossad station in London, who was working also, of course, on international terrorism. We worked together alongside representatives of the CIA and other national intelligence agencies that were collaborating on this problem. And that's really where I first began to get involved and began to understand Israel better. I went to Israel a few times for government level talks on intelligence issues. And when I left the army, you know, I can tell you later perhaps a bit more about my direct relationships and how Israel helped us, the British, over that period of time. But after I left the army, I became quite a sought after, for some reason, quite a sought after commentator on Iraq and Afghanistan, which were in full flow at that stage. And because I was involved in that, I got drawn into the question of the Israel war in Gaza in 2008. I was invited to speak on the BBC, on a live interview on the BBC about the Gaza conflict 2008. And they invited me to comment on why it was that the IDF were deliberately killing innocent women and children in Gaza. And to their horror, the BBC, you remember what side they're on, to their horror and surprise, because they had never heard of my opinions on Israel before, I contradicted them totally. And I told them then that Israel, the Israeli Defense Force, was the army that put more effort and more energy into protecting the lives of innocent civilians than any other armed force in the history of warfare. And that I believe to be true then, and I know for sure even more that it's true today. Now, the interview was very quickly ended by the BBC journalists because it wasn't the agenda that they were interested in. And since then, although I speak frequently on the BBC about things like Ukraine or Iraq, Afghanistan, other conflicts, they very rarely invite me to speak about Israel, only if they get confused and forget who I am. But that's really that was the start of it. And of course, for me, it was a big mistake speaking up for Israel, because how often do you get a former army officer, a Brit, a non-Jew, a non-Israeli saying something good on national media about Israel? So of course, many people got their talons into me. Many Jews and Israelis got their talons into me, and they wouldn't let go, and they dragged me in deeper and deeper. And since then, I've become increasingly involved. I say that was a mistake, of course, that in jest, because although I had a very positive attitude towards Israel from the beginning, with my closer association over the years with Israel, and I go there very frequently, I have meetings with government officials, with military people, intelligence, and so on. And the more I know, the more, I suppose, the more committed I become to the cause. And it's not a question of taking sides, where this side or that side. I also have great sympathy for the plight of the Palestinian people, the Palestinian Arab people who are betrayed by their leaders. But I was taught also by my father and my mother early on to know right from wrong. And I recognize right when I see it, and right is on Israel's side, not on the side of the people that try and drag it down. So that's pretty much my life and my connection to Israel in a nutshell, Rabbi. Not a very small nutshell. I went on longer than I'd hoped to, but you can tell me when to shut up if I talk too long.
Israel. So why is Israel important to the West of the world? What is Israel's role here? Why is the conflict there so important for the world to understand?
Well, I think I mean, there's obviously two elements to that. One is the good that Israel does to the world, the positivity, the really great contribution that Israel as a tiny little country makes to the world. And that is important for many people, and we can come on to that in a second. But the other is that that many people around the world, and you see it reflected in United Nations resolutions against Israel, which are quite common daily, not daily necessarily, but certainly several a year. There is a hatred of Israel, and that makes it important, and a visceral hatred of Israel. And Israel, unlike the numerous other kind of conflicts and tensions that are going on in the world, Israel is center stage to many in the media in particular and in the UN. And it comes back down, I think, to the age-old Jew hate. And Israel has become a proxy for anti-Semitism. So, you know, you all know this is better than I do, but you can't nowadays really say I'm an anti-Semite, or not that many people do. I hate Jews, but it's very easy to say I hate Israel. Israel's a monster. Israel's a racist state. It's an apartheid state and all these things. But it's in many cases, that's a proxy for Jew hate. And I think it does need to be seen in that context. And that incites fury around the world. It was originally, the whole thing, I don't want to bore you with the detail, but originally the narrative about Israel being an occupier of someone else's land began in Moscow. The KGB initiated that agenda and have kept it going. And even today, Russia keeps the thing going. And you hear the old KGB lines against Israel developed in Moscow, taken up by the Palestinian Liberation Organization and numerous other groups. You hear these repeated by students in universities who, if you ask them to show you where Israel is on the map, they wouldn't know. They're really the victims of the combination of Jew hate and Soviet propaganda that persists today. And I think that makes it an extremely important thing for these people who want an enemy, and they found an enemy in Israel. And it's prevalent. I know it's prevalent over there in the US at university campuses. I've spoken on many of them. I've had protests against me. I've had the same here and elsewhere in the world. And I don't really like going to university to speak about Israel unless there's a decent sized protest going on. It's a bit like this Al-Qaeda death list. I think it's a badge of honor because those people who I offend are the people that need to be offended by hearing the truth. Going back to the importance on the positive side of Israel, there's not one country in the world, I don't think, or probably very, very few, who don't benefit from Israel. And I know the technology, the numerous benefits that Israel's brought in trade, in the economy, and so on. This is not really my area of specialization, but I do know for sure that many, many lives in your country, in my country, in other countries around the world have been saved by Israeli intelligence, which is probably second to none in the world. Mossad is a very fine intelligence agency. It's probably unrivaled. They've got one weakness. I'm often accused of being in the pay of Mossad and being in the pay of the Zionist entity. But I will point to the weakness that Mossad has and it's in their accounts department, because so far I haven't received a single check from them. I'm looking forward one day to getting it. But their incredible intelligence coverage and cooperation with even countries that they're technically enemies with in the Middle East, supplying intelligence that saves lives, that allows other countries to preempt and prevent terrorist attacks. And I can just mention, there are many I could mention. I'll just mention one, which was an Irish Republican Army, IRA terrorist attack that was due to take place in the 1980s in Gibraltar. Believe it or not, IRA, Gibraltar, what's Israel got to do with it? Well, Israel was instrumental in enabling the British Army to foil that attack. And that goes right through to the current day when we've seen numerous terrorist attacks, whether it's in Australia, in the US, in the UK, in other European countries, being foiled by Israeli intelligence. So, Israel is so vitally important. And it's also military technology. Military technology has helped Great Britain, has helped us to be more effective against the Taliban in Afghanistan, against terrorist groups in Iraq, today is helping the Ukrainians to defend against Iranian drones, providing intelligence, providing technical information to the Ukrainians to help them to counter the horrific attacks that are taking place in their country every day.
If you can give us kind of a summary of Israel's enemies, its threats militarily, security-wise, Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Authority, what are the major points here that the Israeli government is worried about? And Iran, where do they fit into the security issues right now? Is it a real threat? What is Israel preparing to do? Perhaps you have some comments about that.
Iran is the #1 threat to Israel today. There's no question about that. And the threat comes in two different forms. Firstly, its nuclear program, which it's working on, which it's developing, which it's close to coming to fruition. My understanding is that Iran has enriched sufficient uranium now with just the final few steps to be taken, which are short and sharp, in order to build between 1 and maybe 4 or 5 nuclear bombs. The place that they haven't yet got to where they need to be in order to make that threat a reality is in weaponizing those bombs, in converting the nuclear material into a device that can be delivered to Israel, to Saudi Arabia, or to some other country. And that could take maybe a year. Nobody really knows, but it could take perhaps up to a year to reach the point where Iran has a viable nuclear bomb that can be actually delivered into somewhere like Tel Aviv or into Riyadh. And I can't obviously say what Israel is doing about that, but you can be sure, I think, that that Israel has been preparing for many years now to deal with this. Israel previously dealt with 2 nuclear reactors, one in Syria, one in Iraq, and effectively dealt with them and saved the world from a nuclear-armed Syria and a nuclear-armed Iraq, for which it was condemned at the time for carrying out airstrikes against these reactors.
That's right. Lived through that.
But later, I think, the United States, the UK recognized and thanked Israel for what it did to really make the world a safer place. So the Iranian nuclear program is underway, is advanced, and I believe, personally, I don't know this for sure, I believe my view is that the only country that is actually going to stop Iran from getting a bomb, nuclear capability, will threaten not just Israel, but other Middle Eastern countries and other countries in the world, is Israel. And I'm confident that when the time comes, if the time comes, that unless the United States manages to prevent the development of a bomb through other means, then I believe that Israel will again save the world from that threat. The second element of the Iranian threat to Israel is, and it's not just to Israel, it's to the Middle East as a whole, is Iranian terrorist proxy groups which operate across the Middle East and in Europe, in the United States, in Latin America, and many other countries around the world. And just as an example, Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah, with tens of thousands of rockets in southern Lebanon pointing at Israel, a huge threat to Israel. Lebanese Hezbollah was created and is funded and armed and directed and equipped by Iran. Hamas is also, Iran is not necessarily Hamas's main sponsor or even biggest sponsor, but Hamas is sponsored by Iran, it's funded by Iran, it's equipped by Iran, weapons are provided by Iran. The same is true of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And this is also true of numerous other terrorist groups throughout the Middle East that operate in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, and elsewhere. And of course, one of the big threats that Israel faces today is Iran's buildup of a base of operations in Syria to attack Israel from. They've got the base in Lebanon. That's not enough for them. They want also a base in Syria. They've been working hard on deploying weapons and building capabilities in Syria. which Israel has prevented so far. Israel has carried out numerous bombing attacks and different forms of attacks against this capability in Syria, and does so right up to today. And so I think that is not, the threat is not over, but the threat is to a large extent diminished. And I would say those are the major threats that that Israel faces, military threats that Israel faces around the world today. And most of them have their origin and their power source in Tehran.
So why has the Western world been continuing negotiations with Iran? Do you consider that one of the bewildering things going on? What's motivating that? And was Israel right to object to the original JCPOA agreement that was made in 2014, I believe, from negotiations there? Was Israel right to be pushing to end that, or was it a mistake to have an end for the United States to pull out of that agreement? What are your thoughts about that?
Israel was absolutely right to oppose that deal. And I had the honor of being present in the US Congress when Prime Minister Netanyahu came across to the US and warned the American government against this deal. It was actually one of the most tiring days of my life, because sitting in the US Congress, we were up and down all the time with standing ovations for Netanyahu, which showed, I think, and this wasn't just one side of the house. There was predominantly Republican, but there was also a very strong level of support from some Democrats who saw that what this deal did was actually to pave the way for a nuclear-armed Iran. And its origins were with Barack Obama, who said, Iran is not going to develop a nuclear weapon on my watch. He made that clear. That was a red line of his. And there were only two ways of preventing it, really. One was to sanction Iran very heavily, and then, if necessary, to carry out a conventional attack against Iran's nuclear capability. Now, Obama was not going to do that. Obama was not going to attack Iran, out of the question in his mind. So he still had to stick by his red line, and that red line was the deal to prevent Iran getting a nuclear weapon. But he knew, and we know, that didn't prevent Iran getting a nuclear weapon and was never going to. And actually, over a period of time when the various sunset clauses ran out, and some of them are from the original deal, some of them are imminently due to expire, when they would legitimately be able to build to enrich uranium in order to build a bomb, legitimately. And Israel recognized and understood that and opposed the deal. And then President Trump, in my view, quite rightly, pulled the plug on that deal. But it should have been left there, and sanctions should have been reinstigated. Pressure should have been placed upon Iran, primarily by America. America should have presented Iran with a credible military threat if it continued to work. But no, the current regime, sorry, I beg your pardon, the current administration in Washington under President Biden were determined to get back to that deal. And I think partly it was the fact that some of them actually genuinely believed in the deal. Also, it was partly because it was to turn over something that Trump had done. Of course, that was the major motivator behind many of President Biden's decisions early on. Whatever Trump wanted, he didn't want. And partly to rehabilitate President Obama's deal and to give President Biden some kind of legacy, in other words, renewing the deal. But in order to get close to it, and we're not there yet, and I hope we won't get there, but in order to get close to it, the US and the US friends, the P5+1, the permanent 5 UN Security Council members, plus the EU, they bent over backwards. They gave concession after concession after concession to Iran, and Iran still is playing hard to get on the deal. And as I say, I hope that they won't get there. European countries, Britain, France, and to an extent Germany, maybe not quite to the same extent, but Britain and France certainly are really worried about this now. And they understand the reality. They understand the real problems this deal poses. And I think there's work going on behind the scenes to try and deter the US from from concluding the deal. But of course, you know, diplomatic relations being what they are, I think it's unlikely the Europeans are going to reject a deal that the Americans, if they do, eventually come up with. So if Iran is willing to conclude a deal, I think that deal will be concluded, and it will be to all of our detriment, because of course, once the deal's done and Iran is legitimately enriching and carrying out its preparations, once that happens, it makes it much more difficult for Israel to strike. I'm not saying Israel won't strike, but it does make it more difficult because the deal gives what Iran is doing some degree of legitimacy. So I think that really that's the position we're in now, and it's actually phenomenal when you think about it, that in this era when the Western world is cowed by the Russian nuclear capability and is afraid to do many things against Russia because of its nuclear button, because Putin could press that button if he chose to. You know, if anything, that should have served as a reminder that we don't want another irresponsible country to be nuclear armed. But nevertheless, we're still doing it. And believe it or not, the lead negotiator with Iran on this nuclear deal now is Russia. Russia. Extraordinary.
It's the weirdest thing in the world that you have European countries hoping the United States doesn't conclude the deal. The United States fighting a proxy war in Ukraine, negotiating through Russia with an enemy, Iran. I mean, are you as confused as we are about what's going on?
I wouldn't say I'm confused by it. I'm horrified by it, and I find it very much counter-logical. And when you just look at Russia, the US, European countries are fighting not fighting, but they're supporting Ukraine in so many different ways, supplying weapons, supplying funds, sanctioning Russia, providing vital intelligence that's enabled Ukraine to succeed in the way it has, providing guidance and assistance with planning, and all of this. And meanwhile, Iran, it's not only against Russia, it's against Iran now, with Iran supplying drones to kill Ukrainians and having undertaken also to provide ballistic missiles to Russia to help them in that fight as well. Yet we're still trying to negotiate with them. It's an incredible situation, and I don't blame anyone that's confused about it. And I think it's history will tell, if this deal gets made again, history will tell that the United States administration has been on the wrong side of history over this.
Agreed. Now let's go to Ukraine. What is going on there? Is there any end in sight to the war taking place? People are dying every day. Putin's not moving. It seems like a total stalemate there now. What are your thoughts about that? Do you see any light at the end of the tunnel? What is the strategy here? Is there a strategy?
I believe the US is trying to broker some kind of a deal between Ukraine and Putin at the moment to have an end of hostilities. And of course, technically that would be a good thing, but it's also a very difficult thing because, on the one hand, you've got Putin he's been very unsuccessful in many ways, but he has seized a large swathe of Ukrainian territory in the south of the country along the coast, as well as holding on to large parts of the Donbass up in the east. And Russia has lost, I can't even begin to estimate the number of casualties. There have been suggestions of perhaps 100,000 casualties during this conflict on the Russian side, and probably a similar number on the Ukrainian side. But if the proposal is to return to the status quo in Ukraine pre the 24th of January this year, when Putin invaded, if that's the plan, I can't see Putin being able to take it. So, okay, let's say he can hold on to the Crimea. He can hold on to the areas of Donbass that were basically Russian before, Russian occupied at least, Russian controlled. But he's lost a huge number of people. His country has suffered immensely on the world stage. vast economic damage done to them. Can he say, well, despite all this, we'll go back to where we were at the start? I don't think he can. And if he did, I think he'd probably be deposed and probably replaced by somebody who was worse still, or at least as bad as Putin is. Not, I don't think, somebody who's going to say, well, we'll make peace. It wasn't my war, I'll make peace. I don't think that's going to happen. It could do. We can't foresee the future, but it's very unlikely in my view. So there can't be that kind of negotiation, in my opinion. And on the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians are clear. They're not prepared to give up anything. They want to take back the Donbass, which is Ukrainian territory in the east. They want the southern coast area back, right up to Kherson. And they want the Ukraine back. That you know, every part of Ukrainian territory that's been conquered and occupied by the Russians, they want it back. Now, I think it's unlikely that they're going to be able to get Crimea back. I think Crimea is going to be, you know, it's not really possible for them militarily to take Crimea back. It may be possible for them to push Russia out in the other areas, but I think the most likely thing is probably a very protracted period of hostilities. I think the war is going to go into next year, I would say, and maybe beyond. And even if it becomes, let's say, a frozen conflict with the battle lines not moving very far, we're still going to see violence on both sides, I think, as neither is prepared to accept the status quo. So I wouldn't say it's a completely insoluble conflict, but I can't see a realistic way now that it can be solved. And the Ukrainian people are suffering immensely. In many cities, the electricity's been knocked out. They've got no power. They've got sometimes shortages of water. And they are suffering immensely. But I was talking to a Ukrainian today, someone in a relatively senior position in Ukraine, who told me that although the Ukrainian people are suffering, they're not prepared to give up. They're going to fight on. They see this as an enduring conflict with Russia. And they think if let's say they came to an agreement with Russia, that wouldn't be the end of it. As in 2014, things settled down and Russia then invaded again this year, and they see a repetition of that. So I'm not able to hold out any hope to you, Rabbi, about this. And I hope there's some way of ending the conflict, but it's looking pretty grim to me at the moment.
Yes, that's our Mark sentiment. Just two more things before we open up for questions. You were pretty vocal about the way the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. You were there, you were on the lines there. Is a relationship between what Putin did in invading eastern Ukraine and how the United States left Afghanistan? What did all that mean in terms of world security, in your view?
I think that was the worst decision that President Biden took. I'm sure he's taken many other ill-advised decisions since he's been president. But as all world leaders do, and obviously being president of the United States is no easy job, and everyone's going to make mistakes, anyone who's in there, and they always have and they always will. But I think this was a really big mistake. And I mean, forget about what's going on in Afghanistan, which is obviously horrific for the Afghan people. One of the greatest impacts of that decision to unconditionally withdraw from Afghanistan was the message it sent out to the world. And I believe that, in direct answer to your question, I believe that President Putin invaded Ukraine this year because of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, because he recognized this, not just as US, but NATO. Remember, it wasn't just a US withdrawal, it was a NATO withdrawal. NATO weakness. NATO was not prepared to invest or to hold on in very difficult circumstances to a huge military investment it made over the years. It was going to leave its allies to the mercy of the Taliban, and that's what it did. And he viewed that as weakness. So let's not forget also that China saw what was happening. China is now perhaps the most influential power in Afghanistan today. China was involved in this conflict right from the start, supporting the Taliban, as was, of course, Pakistan. But China and Pakistan together, who are allies, are both very influential in Afghanistan. And China, of course, has its own agenda elsewhere, for example, Taiwan. And I think the message that it sent to China's leadership and also China's people who are afraid of China, people who are worried about getting swallowed up by China, not just Taiwan, but other places as well. I think they got the message as well. And the message is, you know, the United States, NATO are not entities that you can necessarily rely on. So maybe China is an option to take. So it had huge geopolitical consequences. And the most immediate, in my view, was the fact that Putin invaded Ukraine, which, as I say, I think he may not have done, but certainly did with the green light shown by NATO. And actually, we've seen other examples around the world of NATO buckling under pressure, and including this year, Mali, for example. Both the British, the French, and the Germans have all withdrawn their peacekeeping operations in Mali in the face of the Wagner Group, the Russian mercenary organization that is now pretty much dominant in Mali. And okay, you may or may not have heard of Mali, you may not care about Mali, but it's another message that's being sent that the West is not willing to stick up with their allies when things get bad.
All right, I think now we're ready for some questions from our audience and from the Zoom audience. So you want to...
Thank you, Colonel Kemp and Rabbi for the superb.
You need to talk into the mic. Talk into the mic closer.
Thank you for the superb presentation. We'll now have question and answer session. Questions will be taken both from the audience here in the social hall and also those on Zoom. So we'll alternate questions. We'll start off with, I see a question from Richard Anselm. Would you come up to the microphone and address us?
So now we can't do two. You get the echo.
Kemp, thank you for that wonderful presentation. My question as pertains to Israel. Do you think Israel's second strike capability would be a deterrent from Iran launching nuclear weapons on the state of Israel?
Sorry, could you repeat that, please? I didn't get that.
Do you think that Israel's second strike capability would be a deterrent from Iran striking Israel with nuclear weapons?
I don't think so, no. I don't think that Iran acts in a way that we would recognize as being logical. And, you know, the mutually assured destruction of the Cold War era, which still applies today in relation, I think, to US, Russia, China, other nuclear armed countries. Its second strike still acts as a deterrent, I think, against the first strike. But in Iran, I don't think that's the case. I mean, you know, from my understanding of the Ayatollah's mindset, is that their mission, their sacred mission, is the destruction of the Jewish state. That is their mission, and they will be willing, I believe, to accept mass slaughter of Iranian people in order to bring that about. If they can fire a nuclear bomb that devastates Tel Aviv, and the Israelis retaliate with nuclear weapons against Iranian cities, I don't think that deters the Iranians. And frankly, we shouldn't really, in my view, be thinking in those terms. We should be thinking about preventing that first strike from Iran, because we cannot tolerate, we can't even contemplate the idea of a nuclear bomb being dropped into Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or anywhere else in Israel. And therefore, whatever the following consequences of that, it has to be stopped. And it has to be stopped, I think, by Israel.
I appreciate your answer, but with that thought process, I don't understand how then the United States and NATO could possibly let Iran have a nuclear bomb.
No, and I don't either. I think it's really, obviously there are different ways to stop Iran getting nuclear weapons, and one of them is to is to apply so much financial pressure, so many economic sanctions on Iran that it eventually collapses, or has to accept that it's not going to become nuclear and voluntarily disarm or terminate the program. The second is by military strikes. And even a military strike by, let's say, by Israel or by the US against the Iranian nuclear capability is not going to necessarily stop the whole program. It might terminate it for 5 years or something while they rebuild it. But I think those are the two options. Meanwhile, we all know that Israel obviously hasn't admitted it, but we know what's happening, that Israel has been carrying out acts of sabotage, assassination, and other cyber attacks, etc., to slow down the Iranian nuclear program, and have been quite successful in doing that so far. Not as successful as they need to be, but that obviously has its limits. And I think the point at which Iran has the capability to generate nuclear weapons and the ability to launch them and destroy cities in the Middle East, I think at that point there's got to come really serious action. Now, the only other alternative, which of course does exist, is a change of regime in Iran. The reality is, I think no one knows if the current regime is deposed. Let's say the current uprising continues and leads to the termination of the Ayatollahs. We don't know what's going to replace it. But I think almost anything that replaces the current regime in Tehran is probably going to put us into a much better position in relation to an Iranian nuclear program.
Thank you. The next question is from Norman Olshansky on Zoom. Many Americans who have been concerned about far-right autocratic countries around the world are worried about the new Netanyahu government, which has religious and political right-wing members who are perceived as having too much influence over Israeli policies. Why should Americans not be concerned?
Sorry, again, you broke up. Would you mind repeating that?
Speak louder.
Many Americans who have been concerned about far right-wing autocratic countries around the world are worried about the new Netanyahu government, which has religious and political right-wing members who are perceived as having too much influence over Israeli policies. Why should Americans not be concerned?
Oh, thank you. Yes, interesting question. I don't pretend to be an expert on Israeli domestic politics. But all I would say in response to that is that Israel is a democracy. They're one of the greatest democracies in the world. They love democracy. They're constantly going to the elections. But whoever is ministers in this government, when it's eventually formed, are democratic. It's a democratically elected government, and if people don't like it, if people are concerned about any extreme right-wing influence there, then of course they have a right to be worried. They have a right to be concerned and to express their concern. But I think another alternative is to go to Israel, make aliyah, take part in elections, and influence the political process in Israel oneself. I think I'm always a bit concerned when I hear people decrying a democratically elected government by the people of that country, and certainly before it's been proven. I do believe that that in many countries around the world, for example, in Italy, there's just been a relatively right-wing government elected, but that's the Italian. Italy is a democracy. They have their democratic rights.
Thank you, Zach. Any questions from the audience?
Can I just make a comment in there to that? Thank you. Move over to the podium.
Just as a follow-up to that very interesting question and your response, I just got back from Israel. We were there during the elections. And it turns out that there is tremendous concern, particularly by the younger Israelis, about the outcome of the elections. And my sense in speaking to many young Israelis, that many of them were actually thinking of leaving Israel because of the tremendous shift over to the right, which to many of these Gen Zs and millennials is completely unacceptable.
Thank you. The next question is
we may have lost him. We may have lost him. I think we lost him. Yeah.
I'm sorry about that.
It's not your fault. Yes. Yeah. He's gone at the moment.
Kemp, you can hear us trying to reconnect.
I'll let you know when he reappears. Unless he muted himself. Yeah, I saw it drop.
He's back.
Yeah.
He's back?
Yeah.
No, I can speak.
Tell him he needs to unmute.
Yeah.
Can you unmute?
All right, I'm sorry about, I don't know what happened there. Some catastrophe.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Okay, I wasn't trying to duck that question. My answer is pretty much the same as before. I mean, I was in Israel myself a few weeks ago before the election, actually just before the election, and I heard similar concerns, and I also heard that there was a great deal of enthusiasm among young people, more so perhaps than you get in Europe and in the US for a more right-wing government. So I'm not an expert, I don't know, but it's a democracy and it's voted for what it's voted for. And I think those if people are dissatisfied with it and want to leave, then that's what they should do. I think it's the same with any country.
Thank you. The next question is from Larry Miller. The current Palestinian leadership is clearly not interested in a peace deal. Do you believe they are in a waiting game to the point demographers say will be 2050 when Arabs will outnumber Jews?
Sorry, was that the current government's not interested in a peace deal?
Do you believe they are in a waiting game to the point demographers say will be 2050 when Arabs will outnumber Jews?
Well, I suspect there are people who are hoping for that, but I also understand that again, this is not an area of great expertise from me, but I also understand that the birth rate among Jews in Israel is greater than the birth rate among Arabs. So whether that will happen or not, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the best things that ever happened, I think, in this current conflict was the Abraham Accords. And the John Kerry and various other world leaders made it clear that there could be no peace between Israel and Palestinians, except between the two. There would be no peace if there would be no peace in the wider Arab world without the approval of the Palestinians. And of course, that was proved to be wrong by the Abraham Accords. And I think the Abraham Accords gave great concern to the Palestinian leadership, who had rejected offer after offer after offer. And they were deeply worried about what was going on and their isolation in the Arab world, which was increasing. And I think if the Abraham Accords continued to advance, and maybe they will continue to advance, but if they had continued to advance, I think that would have piled the pressure more and more on the Palestinian leadership to come to some kind of accommodation. I don't know if they ever will, but I think the Abraham Accords and whatever follows from that are the best options probably for some kind of peace between the two sides. I only hope that's the case. And I suspect that Saudi Arabia one day will join the Abraham Accords. Obviously, Saudi Arabia was fully supportive of those accords, although not publicly so, but they were. I was there not so long ago myself, and I spoke to various Saudi leaders, and there's no question about what their opinion was. And I suspect that they will probably formally join at some stage. And when that happens, I think that there will be again increased pressure on the Palestinians to come to an accommodation. And while they reject all offers of peace, which they've been doing since 1936 on a regular basis, there can't be any peace. So they have to be somehow pressured into an accommodation, unless the war is just going to carry on endlessly. And let's hope that isn't the case. We've only seen in recent days what happens when it begins to escalate for example, in Judea and Samaria.
Thank you. Another question? Yes, thank you. I wanted to just follow up on your earlier comments regarding the weakness of the current U.S. administration regarding, the pullout from Afghanistan, the message that's sent to Putin and to Xi in Russia, China, and the other after effects of that. To what extent do you think that this might also discourage other Arab countries from joining the Abraham Accords? We even slow down the momentum for it, because they see the United States, becoming a weaker power, not backing Israel, and they try maybe to cut their own deals with them, to protect themselves. They see that the U.S. is not going to be there, to support them.
I think that's a very dangerous possibility. And of course, the Abraham Accords really came about. I think it's pretty self-evident. The Abraham Accords really came about because of incentives offered by the US to Arab countries. And without those incentives, I don't think we'd have seen what we saw. And without a continuation of those incentives, we may not see the Abraham Accords develop. So I think that's an important factor. But in terms of US support, of course, there are numerous dynamics involved here. Israel has often been seen as a pathway to Washington for Arab countries, they've very often used Israel as a conduit into the US, sometimes and sometimes not. And if the relationship between Israel and the US does weaken or is seen to weaken in any way, then of course that has an effect on the way the Arabs regard Israel, how important they consider Israel. But at the same time, I think another of the motivators for the Abraham Accords was the Iran nuclear deal, was the perception within Middle Eastern countries, who were mostly pretty horrified by the Iran nuclear deal, whatever they may have said. I think they recognized then that this growing threat from Iran was not going to be countered by the US. And so what other country could help protect them against the threat from Iran? Israel, of course. And I think that encouraged them to a greater closeness with Israel, some of those countries. Of course, that's not the end of the story. And you're right to raise the possibility of Middle Eastern countries coming to some other kind of accommodation with Iran itself, which we've already seen some examples of in the last year.
Hello.
The next question is from Don and Julie Friedman. Is the current uprising in Iran an existential threat to the regime?
It's a good question, and I can't answer that question. I mean, there have been previous uprising against the regime in Iran. This is probably the most serious that has been, the most protracted, the most intense. But I don't think anyone can tell you the extent to which it threatens the regime. I think we've seen quite a lot of repression of this uprising from Tehran, but we haven't seen really extreme oppression, which I think we would see if the Iranian regime believed that they were under imminent threat. So perhaps that's something to watch out for. But it's a very difficult situation to predict. I would like to think so. I would hope so, but I don't think we can be confident that the regime's going to end as a result of this uprising.
Thank you. Edith Mello, we see you are unmuted. Do you have a question?
No.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
The next question is from Rabbi Weinsberg. Is Israel working with the USA to develop anti-missile missiles now developed by China to counter any Iranian missile attack?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes. Is Israel working with the USA to develop anti-missile missiles now in development by China to counter any Iranian missile attacks?
I think we can be very confident that that Israel and the US are working very closely on defense technology and have been doing for many years. Just as one example of that, the Iron Dome, of course, was a collaboration between the US and Israel. Funding, very large amount of funding, I'm happy to say, came from the United States. The major technology input was from Israel, but I'm sure that the two are working in partnership, as of course Israel's working in partnership with other countries around the world, including the United Kingdom. And I was in a meeting recently with the chief executive officer of Rafael Defense Industries from Israel, who are supplying some extremely important technology for the UK, of UK's defences. So Israel and its allies, UK, US and other countries, are certainly working closely together on countering the emerging threats from around the world. And just a quick point on the Iron Dome, which isn't always appreciated. And I say again that I think it's so impressive that the US is willing to donate so much money to Israel to fund the Iron Dome, to help fund the Iron Dome. But the Iron Dome has probably saved the lives of more citizens of Gaza than it has Israeli citizens. Of course, it's there to protect Israeli citizens. But by having that Iron Dome capability, which has effectively prevented large numbers of Israelis being killed by Iranian-supplied Hamas missiles, vast numbers of them, that has enabled Israel to react in a far more measured, far more calculated, far more precise way in counterattacking against Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. If they didn't have that, if there were Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad missiles smashing into Israeli cities and killing dozens of Israelis, which they could, then Israel would have had to been far more blunt in its reaction, and many more Palestinians would have died as a result. So, yeah, I know you didn't ask this question, but I think it's worth reiterating how important Israeli defense systems are, not just to protect Israeli citizens, but innocent citizens in their enemy territories.
Thank you. The next question is from Claire Walford in London. Zelensky has asked Israel to do more regarding supporting Ukraine with the Iron Dome and other weapons. Do you think Israel should do so, or would that put Israel at risk?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I mentioned earlier that Israel has helped Ukraine immensely in terms of providing intelligence and technical assistance to help counter the Iranian drones fired into Ukraine. And although I don't know this, I would be very, very surprised if Israel hadn't been very helpful in numerous other ways in intelligence and technical assistance to Ukraine under the radar without us knowing. And why should we know? We don't need to know. But I think the direct question about whether Israel should supply Iron Dome, I think there are a number of issues here. One of which I've no doubt the Israelis take into account, is the fact that Israel does not have numerous Iron Dome systems sitting around waiting to give to Ukraine, because Israel needs its Iron Domes to protect itself. We don't know when the next flare-up is going to come from Gaza. We don't know when Hezbollah is going to start launching missiles at Israel. Israel needs those Iron Domes to protect itself. And I don't believe that it has sufficient to make any difference in Ukraine if it gave them away without undermining Israel's own defense. And the other issue, which I don't know how important it is in Israeli policymakers and intelligence opinion, but of course, you know, the technology in Iron Dome is highly classified, very sensitive and very important. And if that system should fall into the hands of the Russians and the technology should fall into the hands of the Russians and be passed back to the Iranians, that would probably undermine Israel's defenses to a significant extent. And not only is it possible that, you know, perhaps less likely, but possible that Russia might overrun territory on which Iron Dome is based, we also don't know the extent to which Ukrainian armed forces who would operate Iron Dome have been penetrated by Russian intelligence, and that information could be transferred to Russia. So there are numerous factors there, but from what I know, and none of us, I don't think any of us on this call have the full picture, but from what I know, I would say that Israel's probably doing the right thing in not supplying Iron Dome to Ukraine.
Thank you. I don't see further questions from the audience, and I don't see any more on Zoom. I'm now going to call on Lauren Haven, our president, to address us.
Thank you. Thank you, Colonel Kemp. This was very enlightening. Thank you to all of you who came in person, and to we had 54 people, I believe, on Zoom, which is fantastic. It was an incredible afternoon, Colonel Kemp. We are so fortunate to have your expertise, to hear your expertise, and your resume is truly, truly impressive. Your knowledge of Israel and all current events has been an invaluable source of knowledge for us and information. So thank you so much for sharing it with us. Thank you, Rabbi, for bringing Colonel Kemp to our congregation. And thank you, Eric, for putting this together. And thank you to the program committee as well. So we look forward to another wonderful speaker event in another month. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, I think it's so important what we've just heard with Colonel Kemp. I think about this daily. We hear on the news so much about people who don't like us very much here in this country and Europe, around Israel, and to know that we have a friend, an ally like this man should make us all sleep a lot better, a lot more joyful, to know that God is really watching over us thanks to people, heroes like Colonel Richard Kemp. I am so honored for your time with us today, having you in my life, and looking forward to seeing you very, very soon, my dear friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Goodbye.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure, Rabbi. I appreciate it. Thank you.
In conclusion, on behalf of all of us here at Temple Beth Sholom in Sarasota, we thank you, Colonel Kemp, for your absolutely superb presentation, for answering many of the questions we've been thinking about these past few weeks. This has really been truly enlightening, and a privilege and honor to have you with us. I hope you will return back to Sarasota in person next time. So we look forward to that. The weather here is absolutely superb, as you've probably heard. Thank you, Rabbi Altshuler, for being the catalyst in making this possible. I thank Lauren Hayden for her words, Dr. Isaac Alvaria, Al Tradil, our Vice President, and all those in the program committee for all their support in making this possible. We always thank Elliot Korn, our Zoom Czar, for his technical assistance, and I also thank Troy Jones for his technical assistance. And finally, I thank all of you here in the hall and on Zoom for being present for this wonderful presentation. So Colonel Kemp, we all send you our very best wishes. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
What do you think?
Hi, Larry.
Let me turn this off. Let me turn this off.